The plane was full, the air buzzing with quiet chatter, when a white passenger suddenly pointed at a young black boy in first class and said, "He doesn't belong here." But what happened next shocked the entire cabin and left everyone frozen in silence. The airport was alive with the usual buzz of travelers, rolling suitcases clicking on the floor, announcements echoing overhead, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from nearby kiosks. As the morning flight to London prepared for takeoff, first-class passengers settled into their wide leather seats. Among them sat a young black boy, barely 16, wearing a neat navy jacket and holding a book in his lap. He looked calm, his posture straight, his face carrying a quiet confidence as he adjusted his seatbelt. Across the aisle, a white passenger in his late 50s glanced at the boy with narrowed eyes. At first, he simply frowned, shifting in his seat as if something bothered him. But moments later, his voice rang out sharp and accusing. "Excuse me, flight attendant," he called, pointing directly at the boy. "Why is he sitting here? This is first class. He doesn't belong." The words struck like lightning. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A hush swept through the cabin as curious eyes shifted toward the boy. Some passengers raised their brows in surprise. Others looked away uncomfortably, unsure how to react. The flight attendant paused in the aisle, her polite smile faltering as she tried to process the complaint. The man wasn't finished. Leaning forward, his tone hardened with entitlement. "I paid good money for this seat," he declared. "I will not share first class with someone like him. Move him to economy." His voice was firm, laced with arrogance, and carried loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. For a brief moment, the boy didn't move. He kept his hands folded neatly on the book in his lap, his gaze steady and unshaken. The cabin was heavy with silence, as though everyone waited to see how he would answer the accusation. The air inside the cabin grew thick, almost heavy, after the man's words. The flight attendant stood frozen, her tray of drinks trembling slightly in her hands. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this was different. All eyes were now on the young boy, and the silence that followed was louder than the noise of the engines outside. People shifted in their plush seats, some exchanging nervous glances, others staring openly at the unfolding scene. The boy lifted his head slowly, his dark eyes calm but piercing, as if he had been in this moment many times before. He did not fidget or shrink back into his seat. Instead, he remained steady, his hands still resting on the book in his lap. The white passenger, growing more irritated by the silence, leaned forward aggressively. "Do you hear me?" he snapped, his voice breaking the stillness like a whip. "He doesn't belong here. This is not his place." A woman seated 2 rows behind gasped softly, and a man in a business suit shook his head, though he said nothing. Whispers traveled like a breeze through the rows, fragments of sentences. Why would he say that? Is the boy alone? What is going on? Filling the quiet like restless echoes. The boy's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of arrogance, but of quiet strength. He blinked slowly, almost as if giving the man a final chance to stop. But the man only crossed his arms and leaned back with a look of satisfaction, convinced he had made his point. The tension in the cabin reached its peak, every passenger waiting to see if the boy would defend himself, or if the flight attendant would dare to move him. The silence inside the cabin stretched like a taut string, ready to snap at any moment. The boy finally shifted, lifting his gaze fully to meet the eyes of the man who had accused him. There was no anger in his face, no hint of fear, only a calmness that unsettled everyone watching. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but carried across the cabin with striking clarity. "Sir," he said, pausing just long enough for the word to echo, "this seat is mine. I didn't just buy a first-class ticket." His eyes didn't waver, his tone steady, as though he had rehearsed this moment not in words, but in dignity. The passengers leaned in, every ear straining for what would come next. "I own the airline you're flying on." The words landed like a thunderclap in the silence. Gasps rippled across the rows, some sharp, some muffled by hands covering mouths. The flight attendant blinked, her professional composure crumbling into astonishment. A businessman 2 seats away almost dropped his glass, while a woman near the window whispered, "Did he just say he owns it?" The man who had raised the accusation froze, his smug expression collapsing into disbelief. His mouth opened, then closed again, no sound finding its way out. For the first time, it was he who looked out of place, not the boy. The boy leaned back in his seat, his movements slow and deliberate, his book still resting in his lap like a crown he didn't need to wear. His eyes briefly scanned the cabin, acknowledging the stares but not seeking validation. The tension that once hung over the room shifted, melting into shock, awe, and a rising current of respect. The boy had spoken only a few words, yet they carried the weight of generations. For a moment, the entire cabin seemed suspended in time, as if even the engines outside had gone quiet to listen. Every passenger stared at the boy, their faces a mixture of disbelief and wonder. Some smiled faintly, others shook their heads in amazement, and whispers moved through the rows like ripples across still water. The flight attendant, who only moments earlier had looked uncertain and trapped, now stood taller, her eyes wide with a newfound respect. She clutched the tray against her chest, as though holding on to steady herself. The white passenger, however, sat frozen, his complexion paling with every second. His confidence had drained away, leaving behind only a hollow shell of shame. You own it," he stammered, his words weak, almost begging for a denial. But the boy didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back comfortably in his seat, his posture regal yet unforced, and replied with calm certainty, "Yes. My family built this airline, and I'm here today to see how our passengers are treated." The statement carried no arrogance, only truth, yet it struck with the force of a hammer against stone. Gasps echoed again, followed by silence, the kind of silence that came not from fear but from awe. Even those who had not spoken a word since boarding now sat straighter, their eyes filled with a new light as they looked at him. The boy turned his gaze briefly toward the window, as though the matter was already settled, leaving the accuser to shrink in his seat, unable to escape the stares of judgment around him. In that instant, the power in the cabin had shifted. The boy no longer seemed like a passenger at all. He was the air itself, commanding respect without needing to raise his voice. The rest of the flight settled into a quiet unlike any other. It was not the silence of tension, nor the silence of fear, but the kind that carried weight, the silence of reflection. Passengers sat in their wide seats, some still sneaking glances at the boy, others lost in thought, replaying the scene in their minds. The boy himself remained calm, his book still resting in his lap, though he did not open it again. His presence alone seemed to fill the cabin with a gravity that no one could ignore. The white passenger, who only minutes before had been loud and commanding, now shrank into the corner of his seat, his arms folded tightly, his gaze fixed downward. He said nothing, his arrogance replaced by shame that burned quietly on his face. The flight attendant moved softly between the aisles, her steps careful, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the boy with an expression of respect she could not hide. A businessman whispered to his neighbor, "That boy is extraordinary," and a woman across the aisle smiled faintly, nodding in agreement. Even the hum of the engines seemed to blend into the background, as if the entire plane was holding onto the memory of what had just happened. As the aircraft descended and the lights of London glowed beneath the clouds, a sense of something greater hung in the air. The boy finally leaned back, closing his eyes as though the matter had never disturbed him at all. By the time the wheels touched the runway, every heart on board carried the same unspoken truth. Greatness is not defined by age, skin, or appearance. It is defined by dignity, vision, and the courage to stand firm in the face of prejudice. And that truth would follow them long after the plane had landed.